Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if being a strict parent is always a bad thing? What if that strictness, which can seem tough, is actually understood differently by kids depending on where their family comes from? That is the big question researchers set out to answer. We all hear about authoritarian parenting, or being super strict. In Western countries, studies have shown for a long time that this kind of parenting, where parents are very controlling and don't show much warmth, can be really hard on kids. It is linked to more anxiety and depression. But what if that is not the whole story? What if culture changes how kids see strictness? Think about it. In some cultures, like many East Asian ones, firm parental control is not just accepted, it is often seen as a sign of love and deep involvement. Parents might be strict about homework or behavior because they've sacrificed a lot for their children and want to ensure they have the best future. This is where immigration and different generations come into play. So this study looked at Chinese Canadian families. They had a really smart idea. They realized that maybe strict parenting doesn't inherently hurt kids, but rather it is how the kids interpret it that matters. And that interpretation can change based on how much a family has adapted to a new culture. Basically, they wanted to see if being strict by a parent was a problem for kids who were born in Canada and grew up more in the Canadian culture compared to kids who were born in China and then moved to Canada with their families. They had a hunch that for the first generation kids, the ones who grew up more with their parents' original cultural values, strictness might be seen as normal and caring. But for the second generation kids born and raised in Canada, that same strictness might feel more like being controlled and less caring because it doesn't fit with the Canadian culture they know. To test this, they used a really cool method. Instead of just asking kids how their parents parented them, which could be influenced by how the kids are feeling that day, they had the parents themselves describe their parenting style. And then, separately, they had the teenagers report on their own anxiety and depressive symptoms this cross. Informant approach is super important because it helps separate what the parents are actually doing from how the kids are feeling about it. It is like getting two different perspectives to get a clearer picture. They looked at about 150 Chinese Canadian families. They divided the teenagers into two groups. First generation, meaning they were born outside of Canada, and second generation, meaning they were born in Canada but had at least one foreign-born parent. They asked the parents about how strict they were, using measures that looked at authoritarian parenting, that is the term for strict, controlling parenting with low warmth. Then they asked the teenagers about how anxious or depressed they felt. And here is what they found. When they looked at all the families together, it seemed like strict parenting by itself didn't really predict higher anxiety or depression. This was surprising if you only think about the Western studies. But then they split the groups. For the first generation teenagers, the ones who grew up more in their parents' culture, there was almost no link between how strict their parents were and how anxious or depressed they felt. The strictness, even though it might have been measured as authoritarian by Western standards, didn't seem to be causing them distress. Now, here is the really interesting part. For the second-generation teenagers, the ones born and raised in Canada, strict parenting was linked to higher anxiety and depressive symptoms. So, the same parenting behavior reported by the parents had a different impact depending on the teenagers' generation and their cultural background. This study's big takeaway is that strict parenting isn't automatically harmful. It is the cultural context and how that context shapes how kids interpret their parents' actions that really makes the difference. For first-generation kids, strictness is often seen as normal, a part of being loved and guided. For second-generation kids, who are more immersed in a culture that emphasizes individualism and autonomy, that same strictness might be perceived as overly controlling or even rejecting, leading to distress. This research has some really important implications. It challenges the idea of a one-size-fits-all approach to parenting advice, especially when it comes to cultural differences. It suggests that we need to be really careful about applying Western parenting research to all cultures without considering the cultural meaning behind the behaviors. For parents and educators, it means understanding that what might seem like strictness in one family might be perceived very differently in another, based on their cultural background and how they've adapted to a new country. It highlights the importance of the acculturation gap, the difference in cultural understanding between immigrant parents and their children who are growing up in a new culture. Now, like all research, this study has its limitations. The researchers themselves point out that immigration generation is a bit of a broad way to measure acculturation. It would be even better to directly measure how much each person has adopted different cultural values. Also, this was a cross-sectional study, meaning they looked at families at one point in time. It would be great to see studies that follow families over time to see how things change as kids grow and families continue to acculturate. But despite these limitations, the findings are super interesting. They add a crucial layer of nuance to our understanding of parenting and child development. They show that the impact of strict parenting isn't a simple cause and effect. It is deeply intertwined with culture and individual interpretation. So, what is my take on this? I think it is a fantastic example of how important context is in psychology. It reminds us that we can't always export advice from one culture to another without careful consideration for anyone working with immigrant families or even just trying to understand different parenting styles. This study offers a valuable reminder to look beyond the surface behavior and consider the cultural meaning behind it. Future research could dive deeper into how specific cultural values like filial piety interact with acculturation to shape these parent-child dynamics. It is a complex picture, but a really important one. What do you all think? Have you seen similar things in your own families or communities? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into how culture shapes parenting, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply. And hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.